Well, we're in the middle of a study going through the parables of Jesus, and it's worth thinking about why Jesus came at all. We know that the main reason was to die on the cross. We know the main reason was to prove his power over life and death through his resurrection. That was the main thing. That was the thing he had to do when he came. But he chose during the 3 years that he was here to teach. And he taught lots of different ways. Sometimes he would lecture. There's whole chapters of Matthew that are just devoted to his lectures. John has a lot of his lectures written in long form, and you can read through them and see all the different things he had to say when he was teaching. Sometimes he would do it through his example, whether it was something miraculous, like he was walking on water, or maybe something where he treated people a certain way, and how they saw him treat a certain people would tell them how they were supposed to treat people. But the big way that Jesus taught during the time he was here was he just told stories or parables. And the agenda for his stories were just to make you think. When he tells a story about a mustard seed and how it gets great big, it's okay if when you're talking about this in a group that you kind of have different ideas. Well, I think this could mean more this or mean more that. I think the parable allows for some of that. I think his big agenda with it is to get people to think, to dig deep and to grapple with some of the harder truths about what it means to be in his kingdom and what it means to be a disciple of his. And this story this week really illustrates that, and it kind of gives us something that can be a snare for any believer. It gives us something that can be a trap or a problem for any believer, and it's tempting when you read this to think, well, that doesn't really apply to me, or if you do think it applies to you, you see yourself pretty much in the good guy role. So what I want to challenge you to do is to think about how this might speak to you and maybe speak to some things that you need to address in your own life, because I think the problems he's talking about here are a lot more common than we like to pretend. So here we go. He says in Luke chapter 18, verse 9, "To some who were confident of their own righteousness and looked down on everyone else, Jesus told a parable." So he's already established who his audience is, and the way he establishes it will probably make you think, well, that's not me. I have lots of problems, but that's not my problem. And it's two different things. First of all, they're confident in their own righteousness. I mean, they don't think they're doing. They may think that they're not perfect. Probably would say that. In fact, nobody's perfect. I'm not perfect, but they think they're better than most. They think they're better than the average bear, and in fact, feel confident enough in that they don't really need that much help. For the most part, they've got it under control. That's what they're saying there. But then the second thing here, they look down. That's a hard word. It can even mean despise, or reject. I mean, they reject or despise. And again, not just some people, but everybody else. There are some people who think that quite honestly, they're doing more than most, and they've made the whole story, our whole human kind of thing, all about them. And so Jesus tells a story to people like that. And again, when I read that introduction, it's tempting to maybe want to skip over the story. I don't do that. And I don't think I do. I'm telling you now on camera, I don't think I do that. But I think I can get close enough to this in some areas that maybe I need to think about it. And maybe you do too. So here we go. Here's the story, the parable that he tells. He says, 2 men went to the temple to pray, and one was a Pharisee, and the other was a tax collector. And when we read this story today, it's easy to read it and think that they're both villains, but that's not how people would have seen it then. Sometimes as a mental exercise, I will think about, well, when you think of a really saintly or great person, famous for being holy with God, who do you think of? And it's usually either Billy Graham or Mother Teresa. Those are always the names that gets tossed out. But yeah, maybe another name, but it's usually one of those two. And if you were to ask somebody in this day, who do you think of as somebody who's really good, they would have said a Pharisee. I mean, the whole word Pharisee means a separated one. I mean, their whole deal was to focus on God and be righteous. That was everything. Their whole life was about that. I mean, they kept every law as best they could. They even built laws around the other laws and tried to keep those two, just so they didn't accidentally do something wrong. If you were to ask somebody in Jesus' day, who's a good person, it's likely they would have said the Pharisees. They're good people. And if I were to ask in that day, who do you think's a really bad person? Now, if I ask it today, Hitler's name always comes up, and I think that's fascinating that one person could be so wicked that everybody in the world tosses his name out when you say who's the worst. I don't know. This is a work of art. That's something. But in this day, if you were to ask people around Jesus, who do you think's a really bad person, they almost certainly would have said a tax collector. Tax collectors were seen as traitors to their own people. They were seen as leeches on society. No one liked them. They didn't get invited to common parties. They really only hung out with one another. And though they were rich, and there's certain influence and power that comes with being rich, they were not loved, and they weren't thought well of. And these two guys go to the temple to pray. One's a really good guy, and one is known as being a pretty bad guy. The Pharisee stood by himself and prayed, God, I thank you that I'm not like other people, robbers or evildoers or adulterers, or even this tax collector. He says, I fast twice a week and I give 1/10 of all I get. So it starts off good, his prayer. It's a thanksgiving prayer. But what he's mostly thankful for is himself. He's mostly thankful for how good he is. I mean, God, I thank you that I got it together. And again, there's nothing wrong with thanking God for your blessings. God, I thank you that my job's going well, or I thank you that our marriage is on good footing right now, or I thank you, God, that my kids are turning into the right sort of people. Nothing wrong with that. And that's not really bragging on yourself, but this goes a little further than that. What he's saying here is that, God, I thank you that I've got it all figured out. I thank you that I don't really need that much help from you. I mean, he says even on the spiritual stuff, the law required that you fasted once a year. And by the time Luke was written here, a lot of Jews didn't even do that. But the law required it. The law said on Day of Atonement you should fast during that day. And usually a fast would be at least just nothing but bread and water. It wouldn't be like a complete fast, just nothing but bread and water for that day. But the Pharisee here, he fasts twice a week. And he gives 1/10 of everything he gets, not just of his income, but I mean, we talked about that in a sermon recently. They even tithe their garden produce. It'd be like a guy raising tomatoes and giving 3 of his 30 tomatoes to God. So he said, I tithe on everything. So what a great guy I am. I'm completely righteous. I'm completely solid. Everything is good. And these were the kind of guys who looked down on everybody. They had a pride that excluded. They had a pride that ignored other people. Real fast, since we're thinking about that thing, when you think about the word pride, and pride's always called like the worst of all sins, there's some pride that's not that bad. It's okay if a kid feels, dad says, hey, I'm really proud of you, and the kid kind of swells up a little bit, that means something to him. That's not necessarily a bad thing. In fact, I think that's mostly a good thing. If somebody's picking up their date for the prom and the guy's 16-year-old guy and 16-year-old girl, and when he sees her coming down the stairs, he kind of gasps like you're so pretty, and he's like, she's completely, and she kind of swells up and blushes. That's not bad. There's nothing wrong with pride. Is not denying your strengths. If you're good at something, it's not pride to know that. All right, it's not pride to know that that's true. Pride is being really honest about your weaknesses. When you don't do that any longer, when I won't be honest about my weaknesses, that's the problem. That's where pride creeps in, and I hide all that. See, this Pharisee, he can't see that he does anything wrong. He won't admit any of his weaknesses. Everything he thinks about himself is everything's awesome, everything's perfect, everything's together, and that's the problem. That kind of pride excludes. It excludes from people. I mean, you can imagine that none of the robbers or evildoers or adulterers or even that tax collector is going to want to hang out with this guy. I mean, they know he looks down on them. And his pride kind of keeps other people away, but it also keeps God away. It's the kind of pride that turns other people the other direction, and we're just not to be like that. Again, pride's not denying your strengths. If you're good at it, it's okay to admit it. But if it really is a strength, you probably won't need to tell anybody about it. They'll already know. All right, here we go. So that's Pharisee. He prays all that. And then the tax collector, his whole position is different. First of all, he stands at a distance. Now, sometimes in church, I find that people want to sit further back. And you might think that that's the same thing as this, but that's not the same thing as this. That's not quite the same thing. He doesn't really want anybody to see him there, right? It's not like he's just staying away from trying to be, because you could read that like it was a humble thing. I want to stay further back, kind of as a humble. That's not what's going on here. He's embarrassed that he's even there. He's embarrassed that people are going to look at him and say, what are you doing here? I mean, somebody like you in this place? So he stands at a distance. He doesn't want to bounce off of somebody. He's sure that anybody there is going to judge him for being awful, and he feels awful, right? He wouldn't even look up to heaven. Well, I've talked about this, I think, in some other lessons. The common posture for a Jewish person in Jesus' day, and Jesus, in fact, it talks about that, would often look up in prayer. Most Western Christians don't. We normally bow our heads and fold our hands, and there's reasons why we do that, but a lot of it's just custom. And the custom then was to look up. Especially if you were outside, you would look up, and as you're praying, you would look up and think that God's above you. But this guy won't do that. He won't even look up to heaven. He's looking down, and he beats on his breast, beats on his chest. It's almost a self-loathing, right? I mean, he knows exactly what kind of person he is, and he knows he's a traitor to his people. He knows he's sold out his family and his friends. He knows that he's put everything behind it just for money. And he knows that he's made God look bad in the process. And so his whole prayer here is, God, have mercy on me, a sinner. And literally, it's God, have mercy on me, the sinner. It kind of recalls what Paul talks about in 1 Timothy 1:15. Paul says, God had grace on me, the chief of sinners. You know, and I don't think Paul's just saying something poetic there. I think Paul knew his own wickedness, right? I think he knew exactly that he was where he fell down, and I think he felt that. Sometimes as Christians today, you know we're saved by grace, and we don't feel it. We can do something kind of sinful, and we're able to carry that very lightly. It doesn't weigh us down at all. But that's not the case for this tax collector. I mean, every clue about him, he's at a distance. He won't even look up to heaven. He's beating on his chest. He's just so. I mean, you can just picture it, right? And God, have mercy on me, the sinner. I'm just the worst. Even this word mercy here, the way it pops up, it's almost like he's not asking forgiveness. Like, I mean, there's no way, God, you can forgive me, right? There's no way you can let all my stuff go. I just pray that when judgment comes, when all my crimes are read out, that you'll just be kind. That's what he's saying. I mean, I'm not even asking for forgiveness here. I just mercy. I mean, I've done stuff that's so bad it can't be forgiven. That's kind of the tone of this thing. I've done stuff that's so wicked, I can't imagine, God, that you'd ever look with favor on me. And Jesus said, I tell you, though, that this man, rather than the other, went home justified before God. Just as if I never sinned. For those who exalt themselves will be humbled, and those who humble themselves will be exalted. Now, this last thing here, this section right here, that's kind of a proverb, but it tells you how life works. I mean, the people who are all the time bragging on themselves and all the time pushing themselves forward, God's not going to listen to them. And really, the Pharisee in the prayer that he makes, he never asks God for anything. He never asks God for anything. It'd be like a person who comes to church today and week after week after week, and the sermon never really stabs them. Yeah, I got that, God. Yeah, I'm doing all right there. It never really affects them. It never really makes them think that hard. It never makes their heart beat fast. I got that. Yeah, God, we're okay there. And they never ask God for anything, and so God never gives them anything. This tax collector, on the other hand, and he did some really bad stuff. Again, you don't want to lose that thing and make him an accidental hero here. I mean, they looked on him the same way that we would look on someone who sells meth to junior high kids, right? I mean, this is like the lowest rung of trash. But he knows he's a low rung of trash. I mean, he knows that he's completely screwed his life up in ways that maybe he'll never get straightened out. He's not even asked God forgive him. Just, God, have mercy on me. When it comes time for judgment, I pray you remember me. And Jesus says he humbles himself like that. God exalts him. He is so in tune with his own heart and sin and who he is that God admires that, for lack of better phrasing. And that he goes home justified, just as if I never sinned. Now, I've heard people like a country preacher at Johnson would talk about how for all those who exalt themselves be humble, that the quickest way up is down. And the surest way to go down is to be lifting yourself up all the time. You let God lift you up. You humble yourself, let God take care of yourself. That's how James phrases it. And I think there's something to that. The best way up for us is down. So the lesson we want to pull out of this thing is, how do I humble myself in a way that gets the Lord to bless me? That's what I want. And it's not manipulating God. He tells you how to get exalted, right? So if I want God to exalt me, what do I need to do? I need to humble myself. Well, what does that mean? Well, it means I need to take a hard look at my ego. You know, our ego, when it gets really puffed up, when we're really full of our own issues and our own needs and our own stuff, it has very little room for compassion, has very little room for love. You know, one kind of a silly way that you can see that happen is husband and wife both get off from work about the same time, or maybe one gets off from work and the other's been home with the kids all day, and they're both there together, finally to have an adult conversation. Kids are in bed, we finally can talk to one another, and one of them says to the other, "Man, this day was so hard, you just have no idea." And how will the other person react? Well, what they'll probably do is say, "You think your day was hard. Let me tell you about my day. You think you suffered. Well, at least you got to do this or that or the other thing. I was stuck doing this and that." And it's just pride, right? And it's a silly form of pride. And it's a silly form of pride that way too many couples understand completely what that's about. I mean, you're so full of your own heartache and your own frustration and you can't even have a moment of consideration for the other person, right? And you're afraid that if you show that little moment of consideration that somehow it lessens who you are. Well, we don't want to be that way. So we learn how to humble ourselves. We learn how to try to listen to what they're going through first, and then maybe not even get into all of our stuff. Maybe our concern for them can take up a large chunk of the evening. And I will tell you right up front, that does not come natural to me. That's not easy to do. I want rewarded if I do something nice at the house. If my day was hard, I want everybody to just go on and on about how hard it was. But when I can learn to humble myself on the other thing, well, God says he'll lift me up. And you may not always feel it that evening. I should mention that too. Sometimes when you're going to great effort to try to think of others and not yourself, it may not always feel rewarding right off. In fact, sometimes it'll feel just the opposite. But God is watching, right? And there's a faith element to this here too. There's a faith element that even if everybody's not standing up and applauding, that God notices and that he cares. You know, some people take the attitude that when I'm at work or I'm at business, some of the Christian ethics have to kind of sit by the wayside. Yeah, I want to be honest. Yeah, I don't want to exalt myself. Yeah, I don't want to be deceitful or whatever else. But at work, sometimes that has to go to the wayside because I got to do what I got to do to get ahead. That shouldn't be true for the Christian. And I'll agree that sometimes when you humble yourself at work, somebody else might step into that void and they might get the promotion. And I understand how painful that is. I promise. But don't lose yourself just to get a little bit of applause at work. You're not really mainly about getting the applause at work. You're mainly about getting the applause from God. The Pharisee, like I said at the end of this, doesn't get anything from God, but we want to be a people who are exalted by him. We want to be justified. James 29:13 says that, Jeremiah 29:13, that's a weird way to write an R, says that if you seek the Lord, you'll find him if you seek with all your heart. So I choose to humble myself and focus on him and trust that he'll make it right. One thing I've noticed as a way of closing here, I had eye surgery a few months ago, and one thing that's hit me after the eye surgery is that I have a hard time at night with the bright lights. It's much worse than it used to be. I know I'm getting older, and that's part of it too, but the surgery seems like it kicked it into second gear. What was already a problem now has become a big problem. This is me driving at night, and I'm just constantly having a hard time seeing what's going on as the people are coming my direction. Now, those lights, bright as they are in the daytime, nighttime really painful, but during the daytime, I mean, even a funeral procession will have all the lights on, and if I'm seeing these guys go by, I'm not blinded by it because the sun is so bright beside it that it doesn't really affect me at all. It's the same light. It's kind of weird, I guess, that it doesn't, but it doesn't really bother me at all because the sun is so much brighter, and when I'm with the sunlight shining down, then it doesn't affect me at all. And the closer I get to the sun, I would imagine it would be even more so. Like if we were on the other side of the sun and Earth, you can't really see it, but it's right here, about 93 million miles away from the sun. There I am in my driveway with my bright lights on, and you really can't see it at all. It's hard to imagine. And there's some things that I do very well. I'm really good at, and you very rarely met anybody who has better self-esteem than I've got. I really think a lot of myself, always have. But no matter how bright my light shines, when you compare it to God, you can't hardly see me at all. And when I forget that, when I lose sight of that comparison, my life gets in all sorts of bad problems. And so the prayer that the tax collector makes here, I've tried to make it one of those prayers that I pray every so often, really just word for word. God, have mercy on me, a sinner. It's the easiest prayer in the world to memorize, and if you really mean it, it's one of the most powerful prayers in the whole Bible. God, have mercy on me. And I think about the things I did that might have let God down. When I was too proud or too angry, too greedy, let my lust get out of control, or let my ambition for something get out of control, when I ignored somebody who really needed me because I wanted to do what I wanted to do. And God, have mercy on me. If I'm standing beside somebody else, I might be able to judge them because I know they did this sin or that sin or the other sin, but I have so many more sins that are going around in my screwed up head all the time that nobody knows about but me. I mean, some things that used to be a movie about what women want, and then a sequel of sorts of what men want, and somebody could read your mind. And wouldn't that be terrifying if somebody could see all the things that are going on in there? I mean, when I think about that, and I think about who I really am, man, there's just nobody that I know who's as big a sinner as I am. Because I can't see what's going on with them, but I'm painfully aware of what's going on with me. So I pray, God, just have mercy on me, the sinner. Sometimes I'll just say that 2 or 3 times in a row and try to think about the things that are separating me from God, and I'll apologize for them. And I know that can feel kind of childish at first, but it's real powerful. And again, my ambition is not to be impressive. My ambition is to be justified before God. My ambition is to be exalted by Him one day when we stand there together. And the best way for me to get up like I ought to be is to learn how to get down and be humble. And that's what this parable is all about.